Donald Trump has issued a lot of executive orders, and they're being challenged in the courts. I'm Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, and I'm going to give you my analysis of the different orders and whether I think they'll be upheld or struck down. Trump's DOJ is currently defending these orders in the district courts and the courts of appeal, but I expect a lot of these cases to make their way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The first is birthright citizenship, and this was one of Trump's first executive orders and the one that is least likely to be upheld. And the reason is it contradicts the plain text of the 14th Amendment, which says that anyone who's born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States is automatically a U.S. citizen. Now, Trump and conservatives, they want to ban birth tourism, and they also want to ensure that children of folks who are in the country unlawfully are not automatically U.S. citizens. The reason this is so difficult to challenge legally is they're arguing that because the parents are in the country unlawfully, they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So it's a convoluted argument, and it also goes against some pretty clear Supreme Court precedent that says that it doesn't matter what the parent's marital status is. As long as the child is born here, they are a United States citizen. I expect birthright citizenship, that ban, to be struck down, and it already has been by several district judges as well as at least one circuit court. Now, that doesn't mean all is lost with respect to Trump and immigration, and I expect him to win his other immigration-related executive orders. Immigration has historically been a federal government issue. That means the states can't speed up or slow down immigration. We saw this in Arizona and Texas during the Biden administration, where the states there wanted to enforce our nation's immigration laws because they thought Biden and his Department of Homeland Security, they weren't doing their job. And the Supreme Court generally sided with the federal government and President Biden and said the states can't interfere. And that makes sense. You can't have California doing one thing on immigration, but Arizona and Texas doing something else. The other challenge now for blue states and sanctuary cities that are trying to slow down immigration is that under the Constitution's supremacy clause, federal law trumps. And that means if there's a conflict, federal law controls. So it's going to be very difficult for the states to slow down anything that the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security under Trump want to do with respect to immigration enforcement. Next, let's turn to DEI and transgender rights issues, which have been a hot social and political issue, as well as something that's made its way to the Supreme Court. There, the conservative majority has said that race can't be considered in admissions in schools, and you've seen a lot of corporations move away from their DEI practices. I expect, based on the Supreme Court's precedent, that those DEI executive orders, for those to be upheld. Now, with respect to transgender rights, the Supreme Court has said that the Civil Rights Act protects gender identity. So, at least in the workplace, I don't think that Trump is going to be able to get away with transgender rights entirely. Now, the issue that we're dealing with now, of course, is schools and sports. The Justice Department will have more success there. Again, this is something that the Supreme Court justices haven't decided. But because in sports, we already have discrimination based on sex. Obviously, there are men's sports and women's sports. We don't have that in the employment context, obviously. Men and women work together. I do think the justices there will allow some line to be drawn on where athletes that identify as female can participate in female sports. So keep an eye out for that. But again, that's something that hasn't been addressed yet. Next, I think the issue will be gender treatment at hospitals and whether that's something that can be banned. Again, this is something that the justices haven't really waded into. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with respect to transgender rights in the medical context and in the education context. Next, let's talk about DOJ and all the different cuts to the federal workforce. The courts have held that the president, as head of the executive branch, has the power to hire and fire federal employees. Now, there's a theory, it's called the unitary executive theory, that some conservatives believe in, including Donald Trump, that believe that that power is almost absolute. Obviously, you can't fire for some constitutionally prohibited reason like race, religion, national origin, but short of that, the president does have the power to fire and hire federal employees. At the same time, Congress has the power to tax and spend. That's the power of the purse. So, to the extent that Congress has appropriated money to be spent, the president can't just refuse to spend it. That's an impoundment, and that's unlawful. That's a separation of powers issue. And of course, there are federal laws that do protect federal employees. There's federal civil service protection. So if those laws are on the books, the president can't just ignore those laws. There's also the issue of whether the president can tell state and local officials what to do. And the answer to that is usually no. That's commandeering and unlawful. But what we've seen is the federal government can choose to withhold funds from blue states and sanctuary cities to make them bend to their will. So, when it comes to cuts, probably lawful. Not spending money authorized, probably unlawful. Now let's talk about Elon Musk himself. Obviously, the question is, what is his role? Is he an officer of the United States? In which case, he would have to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. This is the appointments clause of the Constitution. Actually, the same argument that conservatives made against Jack Smith. Is he an inferior officer? In which case, his position would still have to be authorized by Congress, and any funding would have to be appropriated by Congress under the Appropriations Clause. Or is he just a temporary government employee and just an advisor to the president? That's what Trump's Department of Justice is arguing. But if he is, there are limitations on the number of days that Musk can work for the federal government. So it's been interesting to see how that specific position plays out. Finally, let's talk about foreign policy. And this is the area that Donald Trump will have the most control. There is very little that either Congress or the judiciary can do to rein Trump in when it comes to foreign policy. And this has been the case throughout the history of the United States. So if we're talking about Gaza, if we're talking about Ukraine, if we're talking about tariffs, generally speaking, the president does have the authority to dictate American foreign policy without interference from the legislature or the courts. So that's the area where I expect there to be no litigation, or if there is litigation, for it to be unsuccessful. Obviously, every day we're getting new executive orders and decisions by different judges. So we're going to continue to follow this story, and I'll have an update for you as things progress. Once again, I'm Neama Rahmani. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.